And welcome to Straight Up. I am your host, Marc Patrone. What a difference a day makes. Just one day after the Carney government leaked a story to the media suggesting a pipeline construction deal with Alberta was imminent, Liberal MPs have now denied that any such thing is in the works. Yesterday's report suggested an agreement was close, greenlighting a pipeline from Alberta to the northern BC coastline. The deal would grant exemptions to the tanker ban that now is in place, allowing the transport of crude to markets in Asia. But now a procession of liberal climate hardliners is throwing cold water on the news.
Can there be an oil pipeline or an MOU with Alberta if BC Premier David Eby is against it?
You've heard the Prime Minister, you've heard Minister LeBlanc say a number of times publicly that for any projects to materialize, those projects will have to be made with the accord, the agreement of provinces.
I think the Prime Minister was pretty clear that projects would need the support of the jurisdictions in which they're being built. So I think there's got to be some conversations with the Premier. And in terms of First Nations, I mean, there needs to be significant support. It doesn't necessarily have to be unanimous. It wasn't in the case of Trans Mountain, but there needs to be significant support. And at the present time, I don't think there is. And Alberta would, need to do some of the other elements that the government is looking to execute on, including strengthening the carbon price.
Do you think there's any openness among your constituents for the federal government to lift or create any exemptions to that oil tanker moratorium?
I'd say that what I've heard from constituents is very much in line with what Premier Eby has said very publicly about that.
There has to be Indigenous consent. The province's impact have to be on board, and those are the conditions. And right now, I don't see that. And it's all hypothetical right now.
But the government's position has been clear that the provinces have to consent and that First Nations have to consent before any project will go ahead.
Till there's a consent from Indigenous people and till there's the province of British Columbia online with it, there will be no pipeline. Prime Minister has been very clear, till those conditions are met, there will not be a pipeline.
All singing from the same song sheet. Meantime, the Premier of British Columbia, David Eby, says unless the feds use legal means to steamroll the project past the province's objections, there will be no pipeline.
I'll point out what is obvious to me and has yet to fully sink in for some individuals, which is that there is no pipeline project across the north. There is no route. There is no proponent. There is no financing. Simply because the Premier of Alberta would like to get rid of the oil tanker ban on the north coast does not mean that anybody wants to build this pipeline. I don't see any prospect of a pipeline unless it is fully taxpayer funded and the federal government forces it through over provincial and Indigenous objections.
Okay, so why then is the government leaking stories to the Globe and Mail about an imminent pipeline construction deal with Alberta? It doesn't make any sense, does it? Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre says if the Carney government does push this project forward, it should admit that it was wrong to cancel a similar project 9 years ago.
June of 2014, the Conservative government approved a pipeline from Alberta to the Pacific. November 29, 2016, this Liberal government canceled that pipeline, ordering the Energy Board to dismiss it. March 27, 2021, this current Liberal Prime Minister said that he supported cancelling the pipeline. We're hoping the Prime Minister will announce that he was wrong and that the Liberal government was wrong to kill the Northern Gateway pipeline that had been approved back in 2014.
John Robson has some thoughts on all of this. He'll be joining us a few minutes from now. Well, the U.S. ambassador to Canada says any hopes of reopening trade talks between the two countries may depend on Canada buying more F-35 fighter jets. Pete Hoekstra has urged Canada to buy up to 88 of the jets from Lockheed Martin instead of switching over to Sweden's Gripen fighter jet.
We have a framework, Ambassador, that the USMCA, or CUSMA as we like to call it here. What's your most optimistic view of what the next iteration of that agreement will look like?
Well, on a number of these issues, we're actually waiting to see exactly where the Canadian government is going to come out on this. Like I said, on the F-35, we've got all kinds of people and companies that are involved. We got to figure out exactly, we need to know what it means that you're going to build a Canadian defense infrastructure.
The Trump administration broke off trade talks with Canada last month when Ontario ran an anti-tariff ad on U.S. network television and upset the Trump administration. A senior government bureaucrat says Prime Minister Carney should not have to sell off his stock investment because the country really needs a guy like him right now. Carney's multi-million-dollar investment may put him in a conflict of interest, but Michael Sabia, he's the clerk of the Privy Council, says forcing such a talented man like Carney to do such a thing is complicated.
When a person runs for Prime Minister and is that conflicted, should they not divest themselves of all of the assets to ensure that we can have public confidence, restore public confidence, that the person who is holding the highest office in the land is not benefiting from decisions that are being made, whether they're on a general basis, given the policy announcements that have been made, and when you layer it down to the specifics, there is the potential for profit to be made.
We need access to the best talent that this country can provide. That, I think, requires careful judgment about striking a balance between, on the one hand, the very legitimate point you make with respect to confidence and accountability and transparency, which is what the screen is all about, and why we are being so diligent and so careful about that screen, because I endorse 100% the importance of those principles in the eyes of Canadians. On the other hand, we also have to be able to get the best talent that we can because Canada needs it.
You get a great resume, you don't have to worry about stuff like conflicts of interest. Depending on where and how the government decides to spend billions of tax dollars, Carney stands to enrich himself and his former friends and employer at Brookfield Asset Management to the tune of billions. And we're now joined by John Robson, who's a journalist, historian, and documentary filmmaker. John, welcome.
Thank you.
All right, let's look at what's taken place over the last 48 hours or so. We've had a Globe and Mail story coming out, got everybody excited. A lot of people in Alberta saying, oh, finally, there's a deal, in the works, a real deal that would mean a pipeline from the oil sands of Alberta right to the Pacific coast through northern BC. The government is committed to it. Today, very different story. We're seeing videos of procession of liberals coming out, many of them, hardliners as far as the climate goes, saying, no way. I mean, we're not going to push this past opposition in British Columbia. We have to deal with the Indigenous communities. We have to deal with, extra measures that Alberta's going to have to undertake in order to make oil more palatable to the climate zealots. What's going on here?
Yeah, well, for my money, journalism in this country could spend more time writing about things that did happen and less time writing about things that insiders say might be going to happen. But if they will insist on doing the latter, they ought to do it with a little more sense of what is actually possible. I mean, this ties into this larger weird phenomenon of the major projects office. And so we in Canada, it's very hard to build major projects. So the government creates a major projects office. And if you were naive, you'd assume that what would then happen is that if a firm wanted to engage in a major project, they would go to the major projects office to seek approval. But instead, the Prime Minister approves things for the major projects office to we know not what. Because the next question is, if the Prime Minister sends something, blesses it, anoints it, and sends it off to the MPO, do they have the power to make it happen? So suppose that Mark Carney and Danielle Smith were to say, woo, a pipeline shall be built. How does that change the fact that you can't build a pipeline unless you can get through all these regulatory hurdles and the problem that's half regulatory and half sort of political of getting consent from every single Aboriginal group who is or might conceivably be affected by it, including now we're getting land claims from American Aboriginal groups who claim that their ancestors once did something on this territory. So the idea that if Mark Carney and Danielle Smith said, let there be pipeline, there would be pipeline, was always silly. And then on top of that, you have this problem, as you mentioned, about all these Liberal MPs marching out to go, whoa, boo, hiss, down with fossil fuels, down with pipelines, that the people, especially the federal Liberal caucus, are trying to be more sane about climate, energy, and the economy. But their idea of being more sane isn't that they have ideas that don't make sense, so they should change their ideas. What they want to do is have the same ideas, but have them work better. And then, of course, you got the problem that the BC government doesn't think it's insane on the climate file. So they're just having the same ideas they've always had, which is that oil is bad and energy should fall from the sky. And again, if the media were doing a somewhat better job, they'd be very skeptical of all this stuff. One of the things I really dislike, again, about the way journalism is done in this country, by the legacy media in particular, is the hushed tones in which they discuss everything that some politician babbled as though it were necessarily wise and sensible, when a lot of it is idiotic. And if they admitted that the people who govern us are in substantial measure actual idiots, then of course they'd have to admit that they'd spent their whole lifetime covering idiocy and hadn't noticed it. They had given it an importance it didn't deserve, and that would be bad on them. But their job is to tell us what's happening, not what they wish was happening. And so you get a story like Carney Smith close to pipeline deal, and almost everything about it is wrong except the fact that the Prime Minister is indeed called Carney and the Premier of Alberta is actually called Smith. But if you read those stories, you aren't better informed than people who don't read them. You're worse informed. And that, it seems to me, is a scathing comment on journalism, not to mention, once you look behind the scenes, on the politics of this country, where the Prime Minister and the Premier are trying to reach a deal, which, if they did reach it, wouldn't do anything. As for whether Danielle Smith is being played, I mean, the weird thing about her is that she's always actually been in on the climate cult, right? Danielle Smith's like, we've got to get to net zero, we've got to carbon capture storage. And I've had this argument with her. I said, we should debate the science. And she's, John, we lost that argument years ago, when in fact, you never dared to have it. But she believes in this stuff. She thinks we can take carbon out of the air and stick it in a hole in the ground and it will stay there. And she thinks we have to. So in a sense, she's playing herself here. And as usual, that's not going very well.
No. But I think that, according to the Globe anyway, these were highly placed government sources. And I think are Carney people who leaked that story to the Globe and Mail, knowing full well that they would run it and that it would then be basically slaughtered the following day by a procession of liberals who say, no way, Jose, nothing's changed. I mean, what you read between the lines here is that the government was prepared to force this pipeline through, past British Columbia's objections. And in fact, EB said the same thing, said unless they're prepared to, steamroll this thing, there's going to be no pipeline. But I think if you're going to do a story about the fact that there's a deal imminent, then, the subtext there is that the government is prepared to do whatever it takes to make that pipeline go through, and whether British Columbia wants it or not. So that's the sense I got that, and that it went on talking about the exemptions to a tanker traffic ban, along the West Coast. So there were aspects about the story, enough there, that made you think that the government was committed to doing this thing. And that's why it kind of surprised some people and shocked some people when you had Liberal MP after Liberal MP coming out and saying, no, this is BS, nothing's changed, we're not going to do it, over the objections of British Columbia. We still have to negotiate some trade deal, some deal with the Indigenous people. We still have to force Alberta to up its game as far as, climate, carbon capture and all that sort of thing. So to me, it's a strange thing. There's no leak out of the government to the Globe and Mail that isn't sanctioned from on high. And this was, and I'm just trying to figure out exactly what they're on, whether they're gaslighting people, whether they want to make it look like they do want a pipeline, but then, shrug their shoulders after the fact and say, well, we really can't do it without BC going along. To me, they want to have it on both sides, because they know a lot of Canadians do want a pipeline, but they understand that this is a question of increasing resource wealth to the country, that money is going to filter right across the country. But, instead of doing that, I think they're playing a duplicitous game, the Carney government is. I think on one hand, they want to look like they're pushing this thing, and on the other hand, they don't want to push this thing at all. That's what I think. What say you?
I think that it's a mistake to assume these people are cleverer than they look. I agree with you that this did come from the top, right? These unnamed sources are almost certainly a guy the prime minister told to tell us this thing. But again, one of the things you have to understand about Mark Carney is that he's not a practical measures guy. He's made himself rich, famous, and internationally influential by talking in highfalutin abstractions like Davos man rhetoric, these long polysyllabic catalyzing the leverage of the transformation kind of stuff. He hasn't done it by actually accomplishing things. And so to assume that he would know what specifically you'd have to manage to do to get a pipeline built is to give the man too much credit. And by the way, here, some people think I nitpick, but I'm going to say this because it is important. It's not the government, it's the Carney ministry. It's the cabinet, the top of the executive branch saying we want this to happen. But there's a whole government out there. There's legislature, there's a judiciary, and there's a bureaucracy. And these people are not obliged to do what the prime minister says. In many cases, in fact, the laws say they have to do certain things, even if the prime minister says don't do them. And there are rules about getting pipelines approved. There are all kinds. I mean, as everybody knows, there's this huge tangle of regulations. It's why the prime minister is now off in the UAE trying to get them to invest here, because Canadian firms don't want to, neither do Americans, neither does anybody who's tried it, because it's a nightmare. And these rules exist even if Mark Carney says, I do not believe these rules should exist. And when you talk about, do whatever it takes or bulldoze or this or that, but technically you have to get regulatory agencies to issue rulings, and then people challenge them in court, and then the judges may say no, it doesn't meet the standards. And if the judge says that, you can't just build it anyway. We do have the rule of law in this country. And again, we have this very sensitive problem that if Aboriginal groups say boo-hoo, you can't do that, this is the land where my great-great-grandfather fished once, they're not just going to send in the tanks. Right? This stops projects, stops them cold. They may send in cops on horseback against the truckers' convoy, but they're not going to do it against Aboriginals out in the wilds of BC. The optics of it and to their own self-understanding of who and what they are, they can't do that. So if Aboriginal groups are opposed to building a pipeline in this country, it won't get built. And there's nothing the prime minister can do about that. But, and this is the key point, he doesn't know that. Mark Carney thinks that if he and his like-minded, noble, august persons say, let it be in such a manner, that it just happens, right? They spent 20 years flying around the world doing that and came home with $2,000 shoes. He doesn't understand how government works. He's not interested in how government works. And that's a problem. I mean, you look at people who get put in cabinet, you think to yourself, what actually qualifies them to fill the post of minister of whatever they just got parachuted into? How much do they know about the workings of the bureaucracy? How much do they understand the regulatory regime? How experienced are they at drafting and revising legislation? And the toolbox is just empty. And that's why you get a lot of high-flown talk. We've had a 10-year terrible productivity crisis, right? People don't want to invest in this country. They haven't managed to fix it. And I guess in BC, they've only just now noticed that if they impose an EV mandate that's harsher than the rest of the country, then people will buy cars in other provinces. Apparently, this didn't occur to them for the better part of 10 years. And then you've got the federal government pausing their EV mandate in order to think about what? What are they thinking about? It's just baffling to me. What argument had they previously not considered that they now think they better look at, or had previously rejected, but now they're revisiting, thinking maybe there was more to it than what was said? They talk again in this pompous, gassy way that they go on and on and on, because they've learned this protective rhetorical coding that prevents anybody from asking you what you actually think you're talking about. But what do they actually think they're talking about? Canadians don't want EVs. EVs don't work very well. And again, when the government does manage to dump billions of dollars into subsidizing some factory, the odds are 50-50. They're talking about 100 years from now, and then the thing goes broke in 10 months. They don't know what they're doing. They don't know how anything works. They are good at politics, or at least they're better than their rivals, but they're not good at governing. Because it's the only profession, right? How do you get to be a plumber? By proving that you know how to plumb, right? How do you get to be a doctor? By proving that you know how to do medicine. How do you get to govern? By proving that you know how to do politics. And they're very different skills. Politics involves making wildly implausible promises in ways that sound good and hide the fact that you don't know how to do it. Governance consists of actually getting results. It's a completely different skill set. And government in Canada is broken. It's just amazing, right? There was this latest thing about these patrol boats that have to be retired because they were terrible. And, there was some other procurement story, I'm sorry, the details elude me, that just broke, where, again, they just utterly bungled it and didn't know what they were doing. Nothing works really in this country. With terrible waiting lists, and every election, oh, we're going to get rid of waiting lists. And then it's like, oh, they're still there. Well, what was your plan for getting rid of them? Well, it was to say we're going to get rid of waiting lists. We talk about Canada's health system. Oh, it's not like those awful Americans. But if you ask a politician who's a defender of our system, why don't we do it more like Switzerland or Australia? What you will discover is they haven't got a clue what Switzerland does. They haven't got a clue what Australia does. People can be on the healthcare file in this country for a decade and be a go-to source for the media, and they have no idea what is being done in other advanced countries where they have universal coverage, but they don't have waiting lists because they allow private insurance. It's so simple, but it's not that they disagree with it. They don't know about it. And we need to stop pretending our politicians know things, because it's giving us this incredibly feeble and infuriating system of government, or like the CRA, right? Where they largest expansion of any part of the bureaucracy. They almost 50% more people than when Trudeau came into office, and they still can't answer the phone.
That's so true. Since you brought up the issue of procurement, rather, I might as well ask you about the F-35 issue. Now, we've had the U.S. ambassador to Canada, Pete Hoekstra, come out and basically tie the reopening of trade talks, which of course have been off since October 23rd, with the procurement of F-35s. Now it's out that we're kicking the tires on this Swedish aircraft, this fighter jet, the Gripen, and Hoekstra says, oh, by the way, you should buy the 88 that you originally committed to buying or looked at buying from Lockheed Martin. I think we're on the hook for 16, but not the rest. And so he's tying the two in. I mean, I've seen some of the reaction from people who say this is a kind of brinkmanship. This is extortion, and they're blackmailing us into buying their planes. But I think we'll buy the best planes. I mean, how do you see this issue playing out?
In all the usual idiotic ways, we will eventually end up buying F-35s because we're committed to, and we've annoyed the United States quite enough. But you remember, the idea here was that these things would be our go-to fighter aircraft for 40 years. And so this is like forming a plan in 1918 to have biplanes in the Battle of Britain. Except that technology is moving faster these days. It's clear from what's happening in Ukraine that the future of warfare, including aerial warfare, is unmanned drones. Manned fighter aircraft are the past. They're not the future. And by the time we actually get these planes, the Chinese will have invaded Taiwan and will have gone, oh, isn't it awful? And they'll be obsolete. It's ridiculous that we've been thinking of buying them. We should be going with drones. That's where things are going. They can do all kinds of things that manned fighter aircraft can't do, because one thing, you don't have to protect the pilot against all the G-forces. We're completely in the wrong market, and we can't make a decision. How long has this been going on for? Decades. And where are the airplanes? They're nowhere. That's what about government in this country being broken. The people who run this country know how to talk. They know how to leak to the Globe and Mail. They know how to sound pompous. They don't know how to buy an airplane. Yeah. And we've been through this on procurement after procurement. It's not just bad luck on this one or the politics of it. Over and over and over again, it takes us decades. Look at our frigates. Our frigates are decades old. They're rusted out. We bought used diesel submarines from the UK. Recently, D&D put out this press release about how this one they'd managed to cobble together is the best submarine in our fleet. It's the only submarine in our fleet. And they're not embarrassed. They put this kind of thing in a press release, and they don't get called out on it. But what they can't do is get us submarines, right? Our Navy has no ships. Our Air Force has no planes. Our Army has no soldiers, and if it did have soldiers, it couldn't give them weapons. If there was a major conflict, Canada could not put 1,000 people in the field able to fight. We literally could not. And yet, the national debate about defense never focuses on the fact that our military capability has collapsed because it's in the hands of idiots. And that is across parties. Stephen Harper was no better. Jack Granatstein wrote Who Killed the Canadian Military? It feels like it was 30 years ago now. And the Canadian military has been dead ever since. And so what have we got now? They're going to give public servants a week of training in firearms, truck handling, and there was something else. I think I was managing drones. And then we would add 400,000 people to the reserve. Really? You're going to go to war with people who've had a week's training in 3 different areas?
Yeah. It's laughable.
But they get away with it because they don't get called out on the citizens, but let them do it. The mainstream media lets them do it.
And now the elbows up crowd says we should buy the Swedish planes in order to stick it to Trump. I mean, that's their logic for going with the Saab plane. We want to do that because Trump. It's just bizarre.
Yeah, the purpose of defense policy isn't to create jobs, and it's not to poke the American president in the eye. It's to defend the realm of Canada.
Yep, absolutely. John, how do people consume your content online and beyond?
Well, the main thing is the Climate Discussion Nexus. That's climatediscussionnexus.com. That's obviously on climate. And for the rest of it, my website is johnrobson.ca.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on the show, John. We appreciate it.
Always a pleasure.
And that is it for this edition of Straight Up. Appreciate you tuning in, my friends. Let's do it again soon, shall we? Bye-bye for now.